What do I mean by neo-indigenous cosmocosmos? It's the understanding that in this country, when we talk about education, there's only one population that we've admittedly said we have done wrong by education. We say so begrudgingly oftentimes, but we say, you know what? What happened in education with indigenous populations, with Native American populations, was wrong. People would admittedly say that. Whether you're talking about the left or you're talking about the right, we kind of concurrently agree with that process. And it's not like we're doing anything about it, but at least it's an acknowledged issue. And I start making an argument that, when we talk about urban America, it's important for us to understand what happened with indigenous populations and what exactly was the flawed processes in the indigenous education process. The main flawed process was essentially the extraction of those populations' culture from their education. The process was, I don't care what part of the country you come from, I don't care what tribe, if you use that term, you represent, we're taking you from wherever you are, we're putting you in a place, we're going to make you better than you were supposed to be by making you Americanized. And to make you Americanized means I will strip you from your culture, I will cut your hair, I'll put an outfit on you, a uniform on you. And there's an image that I always use in my slides all the time. He says, population of Native American populations sitting there looking anything but that, and miserable frowns upon their faces. The biggest issue there with their miseducation began with the extraction of their culture from their education. And if that's the case, and we can acknowledge that, what makes the indigenous the indigenous? Their distinct linguistic practices, their close ties to their places of origin, and their shared oppression at the hands of the more dominant other. And if those are the realities that we can use to identify that population, and the extraction of culture is what we can identify as how they were miseducated, at least the beginning processes of how they were miseducated, let's look at urban youth, whether they're Latino, African American, United States, and look at what the beginning piece is in their miseducation. And the beginning piece is the extraction of their culture. That's why I go back to this idea of quality. The idea that we chase quality so far that we remove ourselves from who we authentically are. That's the issue at its core. Because urban youth in the Bronx, when you say, you have close ties, where are you from? You ask a young person, where are you from? I'm from 183rd Street from Grand Concourse. Where are you from, though? I'm from that building on 183rd in Grand Concourse. But you look like you're Latino, like yeah, but where are you from? I told you, 183rd in Grand Concourse. Where your mom and them from? Oh, they're from PR, right? The idea that the close ties to their places of origin are so distinct and so powerful is analogous to the close ties to geographic spaces of indigenous populations. So our indigenous and our urban populations are exactly the same in that respect, right? Distinct linguistic practices. That if I go to the Bronx and I speak Bronx English, or Bronx Spanglish, it's very different if I speak LA English or LA Spanish, for example. That in these distinct places, these distinct linguistic traditions tied to our local spaces emerges that makes us identify who we are as who we are. That happens with indigenous populations, that happens with urban youth. We talk about oppression at the hands of the more dominant other. We're talking about stripping people of their land, for example. But this idea of oppression at the hands of more dominant other, I experienced it less than 48 hours ago. In one instance, it's talking about some person giving somebody a smallpox and devastating a certain population, but it's also present in the criminal justice system that extracts every ounce of dignity from you, even before you're accused of doing it. And if we see that what's going on with indigenous populations are replicated with urban youth, then why can't we call them the neo-indigenous? Neo-indigenous because you're paying respect and homage to indigenous populations, but understanding that the same processes are happening today. They take different forms, they have different titles, but it's the exact same thing. And if the issue then was the extraction of culture from the instruction, and the issue today, or at least the answer to the problem today, is a re-infusing of the culture of those populations in teaching and learning. And if we don't do that, we're lost. Reality pedagogy creates mechanisms in the classroom for the teacher to have to engage in a conversation with each and every one of those young people over the course of the academic year to find out what their emotions and their thoughts are, culturally or otherwise, about the instruction. Does that make sense? That first C, and there's 6 C's in this thing, is this idea of a co-generative dialogue, or a cycle, where the teacher has to engage in conversations with young people. I've done this in my experiences as well, and I'll share a few anecdotes. Walking to a school in New York City, African-American man, relatively young at the time, I'm old now, going to the classroom, and I'm teaching physics. And as I'm teaching physics, I think I'm the best physics teacher alive. I'm in my zone. I know my physics. And as I'm teaching my physics lesson, I think I'm great. The kids seem like they're relatively okay, and life is good. Until the point where I engage in a progenitor dialogue, and I say, well, let me pick 4 students in this classroom that represent different demographics. They all doing okay because I'm a great teacher, but she's always engaged. So I'll pick her, and he's doing it right, but he's never paying attention. I'll pick him. And he's always getting 100, he's always getting a 30. And I pick these young people that represent different groups, and I say, just talk to me for 2 minutes outside of class about class. What you feel about the classroom. And all of a sudden, they look around and they say, you want to know what we think? Yeah, I want to know what you think. And then all of a sudden, my world is shattered. Because my perception of myself as this amazing educator is shattered because they say, well, you know what? The first thing you do is you yell too much. Yell? Right? And the first thing I want to do is say, end of conversation. This is ridiculous. I actually care to share what you think, but they'll tell you the truth. And one of the realities of our experience, the best way to teach someone something is when I've heard this, where a student came to me and said, you only pay attention to all the black kids. Me? I'm progressive. I have the right mindset about this approach to teaching and learning. I want equity. And when that Latino young lady told me you only pay attention to the black kids, I had to check myself. Do I do that? And guess what? I did. Second C, this notion of co-teaching. The only way to have your population feel like they're integral to the process of education is to put them at the helm of the instruction. At the helm of the instruction is the person who's delivering the information. If we all know that we don't understand youth culture, or we don't understand that we don't necessarily know Latino culture, or know African American culture, the best way to be able to do that is have somebody teach it to you. And the only way to have somebody teach that to you is to put them in a position of the educator to share that information with the entire class. It goes to revolves around content. If I'm teaching a physics, I'm a scientist. I keep using science references, forgive me. If I'm teaching a science lesson, for example, I have to ask the young people in my classroom to come up and go up there and prepare a lesson plan based on my lesson. And use whatever you need to teach that lesson. And then get up there and deliver that instruction. And in that process, I sit back and I study the best way to teach from my student. And if that student has a distinct racial and ethnic background, guess what emerges? It emerges in the nature of how they deliver the instruction. And then what do you do as an educator? You steal that idea from that young person to implement the next emotional instruction. The idea is that the best way to deliver the instruction is to empower the young people to share the instruction. And what happens in those spaces, that the unique aspects of their culture emerges. The examples that the students give call back their culture. The language they use mixes up their own different language, but you can incorporate that in instruction. Also, in that process of co-teaching is creating a space where you have to express some sort of vulnerability about your teaching and your lack of knowledge about their culture. And so, when I talk about co-teaching, I also talk about this, and this sometimes gets me in trouble. It's oftentimes a necessity for us who have a very unique cultural background to enter into spaces like these, and these ivory spaces, and sometimes throw a piece of our culture around that wall. It's important. It's got to be a point where our distinct linguistic traditions becomes immersed into the proper academic traditions, and you make everybody who has power to feel a little bit uncomfortable to be on the outs, because that's how you represent for those who don't have a voice. The third C, taking this idea of a neo-indigenous cosmopolitanism and bringing that cosmopolitanism piece to a practical aspect, is knowing that any population who's been socioeconomically deprived, who's been robbed of their languages, etc., all have this idea of a shared community, a shared ethos, a cosmopolitan understanding, a community understanding. Where you're talking about the kibbutz, where you're talking about the cipher, you're talking about people whose voices are not heard, finding a way to connect, and everybody has a role in the community. In an individualistic capitalist America, this idea of a village and a community is lost in the search for the almighty dollar or in the search for I've got to make it. But as people, we all know that our tradition is communal. And so in education spaces, we have to replicate those communal practices that are lost in the traditions of conventional schooling. Every young person in that classroom has to have a role. In classes today, you're the blackboard eraser, you're the equipment distributor, you're the pencil getter, you're the copy getter, you're the eraser, you're the sweeper, you're the window closer, because that calls for something in them, in their cultural DNA, that says this is a family endeavor, this is a communal endeavor, and that brings teaching forward. Sometimes cultural practices are immersed in our DNA, I believe. I think that when you talk about marginalized populations, you talk about how people get together in a communal way, in a talking drum in West Africa, you talk about Latino populations that they dance in a circle, and even today, I could walk down the street, if I hear a bass line and a nice beat, I can't help but just, you know what I mean, like I turn up. Like there's something about that that's immersed in who I am that allows me to call forth something and makes me comfortable in that space. The communal nature of marginalized populations is part and parcel of who they are. Once you create that kind of space in the classroom, everybody has a responsibility, everybody has a role, and there's a smooth functioning of that space, education happens. But we don't learn that in the School of Education. Well, you may hear that, you may learn that here. Right? You don't see that in the textbook. But communal practices, cosmopolitan practices have to be key pieces of teaching and learning for all marginalized populations. The fourth C is context. Context. What do I mean by context? Anybody ever walk through any New York City housing project and look at the flags that you see around? You know, anybody ever make an observation of this? The flags. The flags. So like you walk through a certain hood, maybe I'm the only one who walks through the hood, I don't know. Especially in certain times you get, if the Dominican Day Parade is about to happen, it's arisen, like a whole street, right? But you see these flags that are put forth and they call forth where people are from.
Flags.
Oh no, flags, I'm sorry. I talk fast, it's the DX, it's like, But the idea behind that is even though the young people in those communities are closely tied and rooted to that neighborhood, somehow there's this idea of bringing in context from where they're from to make that represent an existing space to call forth those traditions and the ceremonies. It might not happen all the time, but folks always do it to represent. And that has to happen in the classroom as well. You cannot have the classroom to stand as a sanitized space for extraction of all pieces of culture. That classroom has to have flags. That classroom also has to have pieces of those neo-indigenous realities represented. If I'm going to teach a lesson about weathering or rocks, I got to use a rock that's from that weathered rock in your projects to bring in, or take a picture of that. And then content, which is the stuff that you want to teach. And then content. And essentially with content is just, once you understand that the kids are giving you feedback on your instruction, and you're letting them teach, you're taking examples of how to teach from them, and you're giving them roles and responsibilities in the classroom, and using examples from their community, guess what happens? The content starts firing on all cylinders. If you start with content first, you will never get the success that you would have with looking at these social dynamics that focus on their realities, and then build up to the content. And after you get the content, you need competition. What I mean by competition? Let's get a hip-hop. If I guess I'll talk about hip-hop, we'll be here for another hour. So the hip-hop emerges. The hip-hop then is all about competition. Rap battles and ciphers and one-upping, but showing love at the exact same time. The best way to be able to express to a young people, or show a young person that you want them to be able to express their knowledge, is to create the context where they're engaging in active competition of love with another young person. So our project of Science Genius Battle, we went to the school and said, you guys write raps about science. And the kids wrote, this rap is science. I want science. And I'm like, well, I'm letting y'all write raps about science. Why is it so simplistic? Why is it so basic? And I say, yo, there's some kids in Brooklyn right now writing some bars about science. And their science examples are crazy. And all of a sudden, this rap's a classic. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. I got 2 lines for the way you like DNA. And I'm like, where did that come from? It came from all of a sudden knowing that somebody else just like me is engaging in the same practices. And then we get to battle it out. That rigor of the competition is part and parcel of neo-indigenous. You ever see the talking drum, folks? This guy always plays his drum pattern, the next person plays the pattern and adds something else, the next person plays that drum pattern, adds something else, and then something else, and they keep going until somebody says, man, that's too complex, and you win. But it's all love because the process itself is so powerful and engaging. That's pedagogy. And competition, the absence of competition in classrooms, or the extraction of our notion of competition to become competition to chase some goal or test at the end that means nothing, is flawed. Our forms of competition are completely different. I have to see you face to face, you have to engage in the practices together. When the student is ready, the teacher will emerge. You guys heard that quote? And we oftentimes perceive that quote as saying, when the students are ready to learn and they're paying attention, then the teacher will be able to be great. And I say that's not what that quote means. That quote means that when the person who has the responsibility of the teacher is ready to be the student on the culture of the young person, then the true teacher within that person will emerge. Thank you.